Much of Earth's geological history has been revealed with astonishing accuracy by amateurs who applied basic principles of observation to the landscape around them. Clues to Earth's history are visible everywhere. From the south rim of the Grand Canyon in northern Arizona, more than half the Earth's timeline is visible in the rock layers below. At the very bottom, the Colorado River is cutting a channel into primordial rock that formed more than 2 billion years ago. You are looking at Earth in its adolescence. Higher up, above the ancient stone basement, layer upon layer of newer geological formations, some created by volcanic flows of molten rock from deep within the Earth, others by sediment piled up at the bottom of ancient seas that advanced and retreated time and again. The topmost layers, primarily sandstone and limestone, contain fossils of early plant and animal life. From its basement to its rim, Grand Canyon is a chronological record of geological and biological progress encased in stone. While Grand Canyon may be the best-known record of Earth's geological history, it is not the only one. In fact, scientists and amateurs alike often uncover extraordinary geological and biological artifacts in their own backyards. Well over a century ago, one famous amateur, and no stranger to the geological treasures of Grand Canyon, stumbled upon ancient fossils in his own backyard here in upstate New York. Samuel Clemens, better known as the American humorist Mark Twain, collected enough fossils to fill a small museum at Quarry Farm near the city of Elmira in New York's southern tier. Mark Twain's quarry continues to yield fossils from a time when Earth's biology was much less complex than today. Students from nearby Elmira College come by to search for fossils among the same siltstone and sandstone layers of sedimentary rock poured over by Clemens.
Originally there was a shallow sea here, and this is a piece of wood that actually fell into it and was covered. What you can see here is you can see a little bit of carbon left from the wood, and there's some other little sticks in here as well.
Okay, I'm jumping.
This is probably a clam, and you can see the layers of how it grew over time. Each year is a different layer, and you can also tell by how thick the layers are if the environment was really good and for it to grow well or not.
I got one split in half.
Do I get extra credit?
And then there was a bunch of brachiopods in there.
Great. Oh, wonderful.
What is it with?
These rocks are part of an ancient outwash of sedimentary material called the Catskill Delta, remains of an inland sea that once covered much of the region west of modern-day New England. Over time, this formation too will disappear. The sandstone will wash away, flattening the landscape until some future era of mountain building pushes subterranean rock upward, or until a re-advance of the sea throws yet another blanket of fossil-filled sandstone over the region, or until the glaciers return, as they surely will, to impose their own geological footprint once again. The famous American naturalist John Muir wrote, "Penetrate the wilderness where you may. The main telling features are quickly perceived, eloquent monuments to the ancient ice rivers that brought them into relief." Mountain building and the accumulation of sedimentary deposits account for much of Earth's land mass. Erosion accounts for its appearance. It's an old story, but the latest chapter, the one about the most powerful erosive force in nature, the continent-spanning ice sheet, is still being written. In fact, all of human history, recorded in man's own hand, has occurred during the geologically insignificant period since the last great North American ice sheet melted. Put another way, the ice moved out of New York State about 90 centuries ago. The march of human civilization has been going on for half that long, about 46 centuries. Earth's geological history, on the other hand, spans about 46 million centuries. Prehistoric humans probably lived through another earlier ice age. There's plenty of evidence that ice sheets, miles thick in some places, have come and gone many times across Earth's high latitudes. And because of slight shifts in the way the Earth faces the sun, shifts that recur every 100,000 years or so, it is inevitable that future generations of plants and animals will have to adapt to the next ice age, already on its way. Scientists say the most recent post-glacial period, the one in which we now live, will come to an end sometime during the next several thousand years, to be followed by yet another return of all-encompassing, mountain-crushing ice. How much ice? Viewed from the summit of Whiteface Mountain among the high peaks of the Adirondacks, Mount Marcy, the highest point in New York State, is just visible on the horizon 30 miles to the east. At 5,400 feet above sea level, Mount Marcy's summit towers above all the peaks visible here. Now imagine ice stretching upward to the height of two Mount Marcys, one atop the other, covering this scene completely, a colossal mass of frozen water that remained in place for 100,000 years. Ice ages change everything. So much of Earth's water is captured and held in glaciers that sea levels plummet. Land bridges between continents emerge from the sea as the water level is drawn down. Arid deserts appear where dense forests once stood. New valleys are carved by the grinding action of glaciers in motion. Massive deposits of glacial till, stone and soil carried along by the ice, reconfigure lakes and rivers and streams. Plant and animal habitats are obliterated, then reconstituted, always differently. Some scientists theorize that slight evolutionary differences among species of plants and animals in North America may result from long periods of separation of individuals of one species from their kin on the other side of ice shields, massive barriers that sat at the continent's midsection for untold thousands of years. The black-throated sparrow, for example, is found only west of the Great Plains and east of the Sierra Nevada. Its cousin, the field sparrow, is exclusively an eastern bird. Wood warblers are another good example. All are related, but scores of different species have evolved through a process called geographic isolation. This yellow warbler, foraging along the Lake Ontario shoreline, is genetically related to this Grace's warbler foraging in the ponderosa pine wilderness of central Arizona, but clearly different in plumage and song. This western bluebird perched nearby is genetically related to this eastern bluebird nesting in New York's Finger Lakes region, but different in appearance and, to some extent, in behavior and vocalization. This eastern gray squirrel has rounded ear tips. Abert squirrel, found only in regions of the American West, has tasseled ears. They're similar, but genetically different in significant ways. You won't find an Abert squirrel in upstate New York, but its ancient ancestors and those of the gray squirrel were one and the same before the great ice sheets intersected their common habitat, leaving some on one side, some on the other. The current geography, geology, and ecology of most of upstate New York and all of Ontario, Quebec, and the Canadian Maritimes to the north result from changes brought on by the last great ice sheet, the Laurentide, as it retreated northward about 9,000 years ago. Within New York State, only this highland south of the Allegheny River near the modern-day city of Olean escaped the Laurentide. Here the geology is different from any other. Where most of the rest of upstate lies atop rocks and soil dragged into the region from the north by enormous glaciers that advanced and retreated repeatedly over thousands of years, this area features remnants of Ice Age movements from a much earlier time. These enormous boulders may have advanced from the distant southeast, or even from deep within the earth when an enormous continent broke in two to form North America and Africa. This rock formation is a 350 million year old conglomeration of polished quartz fragments suspended in sedimentary material piled up over millennia, layer upon layer. The speed of flowing water in which these quartz pebbles were suspended is recorded forever in wavy patterns of rigid stone. Where the stones are close together, the flow rate was slower than where they appear farther apart. This particular collection of rock formations has its own unusual microecology. Trees anchored on top of these monoliths appear to have sprouted recently, but in fact may be 100 years old or older. Their roots have penetrated minute cracks in the rock surface to tap moisture seeping down from ancient mossy soil mats above. It's possible that 200,000 years or more before present time, early humans stood atop this rock formation facing northward. If so, the landscape, as it appeared to them at that time, was doomed, destined for obliteration in the colossal, mile-thick, ice-borne destruction of the Wisconsinan period, a cataclysmic geological event that would occur thousands of years in the future. That destruction is now complete and visible everywhere in the region. Today, in the 21st century, Ice Age formations are the landscape of upstate New York. Along New York's southern tier, to the south of the Finger Lakes region, this broad upland area is, for the most part, a massive pile of rock and soil pushed along by the ice sheet and left behind when it retreated. This formation, called a terminal moraine, is the southern boundary of the final advance of the Laurentide. The Finger Lakes were once river valleys that were later scoured out by the ice. Junctions of tributaries with those ancient rivers were at first blocked by ice, then sheared away by glaciers that repeatedly advanced and retreated like gigantic ripsaws, pulverizing valley walls, leaving streams suspended in thin air. These hanging streams were ancestors of the many spectacular Finger Lakes waterfalls that populate the region today. These lakeside formations, called truncated spurs, give this shoreline a finely sculpted appearance on both shores. Geologists say the Laurentide ice sheet may have merely buffed up this deep valley that now holds Canandaigua Lake. An earlier ice age may have done the heavy lifting, grinding out a valley whose water courses traveled south before the Laurentide blocked them to form the Finger Lakes. South of Canandaigua Lake, another valley, home to the ancient West River, now a creek-like stream that once ran with colossal volume and force along this trough into the long-gone Dansville River, whose outflow created Irondequoit Bay near Rochester. Today, the valley walls of this vineyard-laden bottomland remain, monuments to the raging torrent that poured westward as glaciers melted. North of the Finger Lakes, along the southern shore of Lake Ontario, from Oswego in the east to Rochester in the west, 10,000 sandy mounds, called drumlins, mark the landscape atop what was only recently, in geological time at least, the bottom of a huge inland freshwater sea, Glacial Lake Iroquois. Drumlins are small hills of glacial till left behind by the melting ice sheet. Most are situated from slightly northeast to slightly southwest in a consistent pattern that traces the direction of the last pass of ice as it moved through the region. For thousands of years, Lake Ontario has been slicing away at the ends of these east shore drumlins, opening windows into the process of glacial deposition. At Chimney Bluffs, on Ontario's eastern shore, towering sand, exposed from the collapse of drumlin walls at the lake's edge, yellow cliffs pounded relentlessly by fierce waves. With each cascade of sand, more Ice Age geology returns to the light of day for the first time in perhaps 20,000 years. No longer protected by leafy forest carpets that covered it for thousands of years, sand is suddenly exposed to Lake Ontario's fierce winds and rains. The result is a dramatic panorama of geometric patterns, twisting spires, and angled peaks that melt away, then reappear with each passing stormy season. Occasionally, huge boulders, no longer supported by the sandy core, crash down onto the lakeshore, bringing with them full-grown trees and other debris. These glacial artifacts, called erratics, traveled along above, in, and below the Laurentide ice sheet. Many are believed to have originated far to the north. This erratic, suddenly released from the sandy tomb where it lay buried for perhaps 100,000 years, will spend the next 1,000 or so here, relentlessly pummeled by waves and winter ice. It may break into smaller pieces before being entombed once again beneath the lake's surface as the eastern Lake Ontario shoreline continues to edge eastward. Some drumlin-like formations are called eskers and kames, deposits left behind by streams that ran over, under, and through the glaciers. This esker, a ridge that runs along the western edge of the vast Montezuma Marsh, towers above a small stream sidling along its western flank, named, appropriately, Esker Brook. Farther to the east, and 60 miles inland from the current shore of Lake Ontario, huge sand dunes underlie an ancient pine woods, a unique island of rare plants surrounded by a sea of northern hardwood forest land. These dunes, far from any modern-day body of water capable of generating such enormous piles of sand, are part of an unusual formation called the Rome Sand Plains. This region, too, is a remnant of glacial Lake Iroquois. The position of these dunes in relation to other local landscape features indicates they were formed by powerful waves and westerly winds that spilled down from atop the glaciers. The winds picked up rock powder, residue from thousands of years of grinding away at stone surfaces by lobes of the ice sheet, then hurled it into piles along the edges of ice walls. There was little or no plant life near the lip of the ice sheet until long after the frozen mass retreated, leaving behind a desert of sand and cobblestones. Later, tundra-like conditions took hold, as long-dormant alpine plants began to emerge. Reindeer lichen, common in alpine regions, is found here. The Sand Plains host one of New York State's few inland stands of pitch pine, the conifer that more typically anchors maritime forests along the sandy back dunes of the Atlantic coast. These dunes are home to rare wild lupine, a fragile flowering plant that hosts the even rarer frosted elfin, a thumbnail-sized butterfly that feeds only on lupine plants. The frosted elfin, found nowhere else in New York State, is incapable of flying more than a few yards beyond the plant near which it was spawned. The Sand Plains border a broad basin to the south, the western end of the Mohawk River Valley. This channel was a major drainage route for meltwater flowing out of Lake Iroquois toward the sea by way of the Hudson River Valley. There's evidence that huge ice dams just east of the Sand Plains repeatedly collapsed with catastrophic effect downstream. All that remains is wildly meandering Wood Creek, ranging back and forth across the sandy landscape. From the air, Wood Creek bears a striking resemblance to barrier dune tidal creeks found in sandy wetland areas along ocean coastlines. There's no other inland stream in upstate New York quite like it. Wood Creek, a direct descendant of the Ice Age melt-off, has a storied history. Native Americans, and later pre-colonial explorers, and still later early European settlers used Wood Creek as their primary transportation route into the American wilderness. Shortly after the Revolutionary War, American industrialists attempted to improve navigation by cutting through meandering oxbows to create the Western Inland Canal, later replaced by the Erie Canal, and still later by today's New York State Barge Canal. The effect of those early canal construction efforts, completed more than 300 years ago, are still visible in satellite imagery. From space, the Rome sand plains still show sculpting from Ice Age meltwater roaring eastward. Farther north, atop the Tug Hill Plateau near the hamlet of Altmar, more Ice Age artifacts. Ancient bogs and kettle pools formed when huge chunks of ice trapped below the soil line at the end of the last ice age melted. Altogether, these wetland formations sustain the largest known ice age aquifer in the region. Conditions here sustain a cycle of life perpetuated by unique ecology and remoteness. Certain wildflowers, like these turtle heads, often used to accent suburban flower gardens, are native here. Cardinal flowers, also native in the upstate New York region, are among the first species to disappear when wetlands are disturbed for development. Here, they thrive. Wherever such unique ecology is perpetuated over time, the presence of certain animal species is predictable. A red newt forages for worms on this dead tree in a late stage of returning important nutrients to the micro-community from which it emerged. This expansive kettle pond is covered by a thick layer of dead plants that accumulate at the onset of winter. It has become a floating bog, home to rare ferns, delicate native orchids, and carnivorous species that trap and ingest insects. It's a good bet that deep within at least some of these bogs lie the remains of hulking animals that disappeared shortly after the ice retreated. Scientists have determined that during the period immediately after the ice sheet receded, a major ecological event occurred that is as baffling as it was abrupt. Large mammals of the ice era began to die off, resulting in the largest wave of extinctions of mammals known to have occurred before or since. These included ferocious creatures, the dire wolf, saber-toothed tiger, and short-faced bear. The Museum of the Earth near Ithaca presents an interpretive display describing the upstate New York landscape during the time when these animals and the dinosaurs that preceded them roamed the countryside. One exhibit, a complete skeleton of a mastodon discovered in a bog in the Hudson Valley region in 1999, is yet another link between the modern age and the Ice Age. A number of theories have developed over the years in attempts to explain why these giant creatures died off. Some scientists cite possible overhunting by humans who may have streamed across land bridges from Asia during the Ice Age, then made their way eastward and northward as the ice receded. There's clear evidence that Paleo-Indians hunted mastodons. Others blame significant climate changes that may have limited available forage. There's also compelling evidence that toward the end of the last ice age, atmospheric temperatures were significantly higher than today. Whatever calamity spelled the end of these ice age mammals, the mastodont era was a significant part of New York State's ecological history, one that is chronicled in an elegant interpretive display at the New York State Museum in Albany. Along Earth's geological timeline, these animals were grazing upstate valleys and hillsides just yesterday, alongside early humans. Many questions remain about why the mastodont and the equally mysterious woolly mammoth disappeared over a relatively short span. Future generations may one day reveal the answers. Both the Hyde Park mastodont and a similar find, the Gilbert mastodont, uncovered at a site north of Elmira, also in 1999, were unearthed at the bottom of mud-filled pools that originated as kettle ponds. A particularly fine example is Beaver Lake, just west of Baldwinsville, New York, site of a magnificent old-growth hemlock forest and an exceptional floating peat bog along its margins. Each serves as ideal habitat for certain birds and animals. Still farther to the north, a different effect from glacial runoff. Here, meltwater ran out and across a broad, stony plain that underlies much of the northeastern shoreline of Lake Ontario. This unusual limestone formation was scrubbed clean by the ice sheet as it melted away. This formation, called limestone pavement, is home to yet another unique Ice Age ecosystem, a throwback to a time shortly after the ice retreated, when the region was a barren desert. Eventually, this pavement generated a thin layer of soil that captured seeds blown in from the west on relentless icy winds. Some of these seeds established colonies previously found only in the faraway southwest and regions north of the Great Lakes. Here at Chaumont Barrens Preserve on Cape Vincent, one such fragile ecosystem is thriving. Prairie Smoke is a rare wildflower in this region, completely absent from North America east of this unique area of upstate New York. In spring, it produces long, stringy lavender petals that give the appearance of low-hanging smoke when they dance in the slightest breeze. Scientists call this rare combination of geology and ecology an Alvar system. It is one of a very few such systems in the world, and was discovered here by scientists from Finland less than 50 years ago. Not many plants can thrive in such a harsh environment. Thin soil that floods in the spring as snowmelt glides across the hard surface, then bakes at up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer as the limestone pavement below absorbs heat from the sun. The colossal weight of the ice sheet cracked this pavement in places. Since then, constant heating, cooling, and washing of the surface have eroded these fissures, resulting in angular patterns of fractured pavement, home to an unusual collection of plants, animals, and marine life. These barrens include rare wild yellow lady's slipper and delicate, colorful wild columbine. Rare grasses produce fragile meadows unlike any found in the northeastern United States. Some bird species are attracted by a unique diversity of plants and other wildlife that sustain them. common yellowthroat, is found here. Field sparrows sing from stunted eastern white cedars that rose from the pavement before succumbing to the harsh conditions. Alvar forests are low and scrubby, a testament to the limits of thin soil and extreme variability of seasonal conditions. A few miles south of Chaumont Barrens, an uncommon lakeside barrier dune system stretches 17 miles along Lake Ontario's eastern shoreline. These dunes are home to rare Champlain beachgrass, another remnant of the ice era.
Behind that, you'll see the big dune back there.
Champlain beachgrass occurs here, along the St. Lawrence River shoreline and along the shores of Lake Champlain. Geologists have only one explanation. Toward the end of the last ice age, an inland lake or sea blocked by the retreating ice walls connected this area with now landlocked Lake Champlain via the St. Lawrence River Valley. Conservationists working to stabilize these dunes introduced Cape beachgrass, a variety found on the Atlantic coast before they realized it may pose a threat to the native Champlain beachgrass by crowding it out of its native habitat. Each plant and animal species is bound by its nature to a particular method of moving from place to place. Beachgrass, while its feather-light seeds can and do travel long distances on seasonal winds, grows under complex soil conditions that occur almost exclusively on beaches and along sandy river shorelines. Some plants rely on insects or animals to carry their seeds along, even bury them in order to expand their ranges. This bull thistle relies on songbirds to release airborne seeds from pouches beneath its flower heads. While foraging for seeds, this goldfinch releases many more than it consumes, and each sets sail for parts unknown, where they find just the right combination of weather patterns, soil conditions, and sunlight. Some will find fertile ground and take root. Scientists have pieced together a succession of plants and animals that became established in this region, one following another when the glaciers moved on. The first forests were composed of mostly black spruce and jack pine, no strangers to Arctic-like environments. These species are capable of surviving in temperatures to 40 below zero Fahrenheit and colder. In regions where temperatures are so low that black spruce trees are unable to produce seeds, that species has adapted by cloning itself as a way to spread its range. Each cloned stem emerges from a process called layering, in which all related individual trees are genetically identical. Such forests occur in frigid corners of the world well beyond the northern limits of seed-borne black spruce and other Arctic region tree species. Some modern-day individual trees formed from cloning are thought to be up to 5,000 years old, putting them within range of the Laurentide retreat. Another tree with ancient ancestry that thrived at the edge of glaciers is the American white cedar, a familiar resident of the limestone pavement Alvar system at Chaumont, and a predictable species along lake shores and at the edges of ponds and wetlands with links to the Ice Age. Stumbling upon a stand of cedars in the wild is a reliable sign that some mysterious Ice Age wonder has survived and may be right underfoot. This is the case near the city of Syracuse, where, hidden below ancient cedar-lined shores, lie three of the most unusual Ice Age lakes in the world. Plunge holes formed by what must have been a spectacular waterfall along the course of an ancient river that flowed below the southern wall of the Laurentide ice sheet. No more than a few hundred feet wide, these lakes are almost as deep. The river that formed in central New York tumbled over the edge of this rock formation at the northern edge of the Appalachian Plateau. The waterfall that scoured them out of this limestone bedrock may have been at least as powerful as the spectacular falls at Niagara. Erosion from falling water is a powerful force. Throughout central New York, the retreating ice sheet had exposed layers of sedimentary rock with varying susceptibility to erosion. Formations that readily eroded broke down and disappeared over time, while harder, more resistant rock remained in place much longer. The Niagara River is the one and only outflow for all four western Great Lakes: Superior, Huron, Michigan, and Erie. Niagara Falls tumbles over a formation whose caprock, or topmost layer, is composed of the seemingly indestructible mineral dolomite. But even dolomite, one of the hardest, most resistant minerals found in nature, does eventually succumb to erosion. All sorts of pressures take hold to break it down: constant shifting of adjacent rock layers, fractures caused by freezing and thawing, and even today, thousands of years after the ice sheet melted away, the effects of upwarping, the rebounding of the Earth's crust from the crushing weight of the Laurentide. Throughout the rock layers just below the top of the falls are cracks called joints that result from all these forces at work. The network of joints below Niagara Falls is so extensive, scientists claim that nearly as much water flows through these openings into the plunge hole below as descends from the river above. When European explorers first laid startled eyes upon this cataract almost 400 years ago, the falls were retreating from erosion at a rate of about 6 feet per year. Only by periodically stopping the flow over parts of the falls in order to reinforce the limestone walls that support them have huge sections of rock face been prevented from collapsing into the river at the same rate. And that's only half the story, literally. During the 20th century, much of the flow above the falls was diverted into adjacent man-made subterranean channels to drive huge turbines that generate electricity. Today, the average daily flow over Niagara Falls is about half its historical volume, even less in winter. Imagine the magnitude of water and spray, the even more deafening roar when the river was flowing freely over the Niagara escarpment. Now imagine the same scene above Green Lake, and many hundreds of years later, but just a few hundred yards further along, above Round Lake, and even later above Glacier Lake, when that ancient glacial river cut its way westward. The Niagara River has left a number of plunge holes along its 12-mile course to Lake Ontario. Perhaps one day, after the next ice sheet relegates the river and the Great Lakes to geological history, the landscape here at Niagara's famous Devil's Hole will resemble that of modern-day Round Lake. Green Lake and Round Lake are unusual in many ways. For one, there's the blue-green color visible at the surface. Unlike most lakes and ponds, these do not turn over. Water at the top, containing high levels of oxygen, never mixes with water at the bottom that is completely devoid of oxygen. In fact, the water at the bottom of both lakes has not changed for thousands of years. Most lakes and ponds turn over on a regular basis, pushed along by winds. Water at the surface is forced to the bottom in a cycle that brings water at the bottom to the top again and again. In that way, the entire body of water is oxygenated. But most lakes and ponds are relatively shallow and wide. Not so the Green Lakes or Glacier Lake. Without oxygen, nothing can live below a certain level, and nothing does in Round Lake, Green Lake, or Glacier Lake. With no organisms to decompose it, core samples from the bottom have produced organic material unchanged from the time it floated down from above hundreds of years ago. There's a layer separating the dead zone below from oxygenated water above, and in this intermediate layer, extremely rare organisms occur. Above it, these lakes contain enough oxygen to sustain certain freshwater fish and plants. Green Lake and Round Lake are protected from winds by a rim of ancient white cedars surrounded by some of the oldest remaining virgin forest land in North America. Among the trees here are specimens that have been determined by scientists to be among the oldest in eastern North America. Upland forests across the region were clear-cut during the 19th century by European settlers to make way for agriculture, fuel steam railroads, and supply growing industry. The forest around the Green Lakes has never been harvested. Many of these tall hardwoods were already growing here when the American Revolutionary War began. Ecologists have learned that undisturbed old-growth trees grow very slowly. Canadian botanists recently discovered that some white cedars growing on cliff surfaces along the Niagara escarpment in the province of Ontario have been alive for almost 1,000 years. Might the same be true of some of the cedars growing here at Glacier Lake? And beneath this tree, what appear to be remnants of layers of limestone that have mostly eroded away from surrounding landscape. Might these be remains of the ancient escarpment over which the Green Lakes waterfalls plunged into bedrock basins below? Another artifact of the glacial meltdown is Moss Island at Little Falls on the Mohawk River. Huge ice dams that held back glacial Lake Iroquois in the vicinity of Oneida Lake collapsed periodically with catastrophic effect, sending huge volumes of meltwater eastward toward the Hudson Valley. Glacial melt roared across this natural dam on the Mohawk Trough for thousands of years, its swirling sediment driving potholes deep into the almost indestructible rock layer. Moss Island is a stony outcrop composed of some of the oldest rock base found in upstate New York. Primordial gneiss, Adirondack granite dating to the formation of Earth's crust. This enormous pothole was exposed on one side as erosion pierced its eastern wall. This 6-foot-tall man easily fits into the cavernous chamber, one of many chimney potholes on the island. New York State has many undisturbed old forests in places where human activity has had minimal impact over the centuries. Here, among the high peaks of the Adirondack Mountains, some high-altitude plant communities have been spared by their relative inaccessibility and inhospitable climate. Like dwarf cedars and hardwoods that have clung to rock faces of the Niagara escarpment for centuries, these small pines, spruces, and firs may be nearly as old, and certainly just as hardy. The air temperature atop Whiteface Mountain on this July day is a relatively cool and dry 63 degrees Fahrenheit at noon. the air temperature at Lake Placid, just a few miles away but 3,000 feet lower in elevation, is a very humid 86. This dark-eyed junco is a common sight in New York State during the bleakest days of midwinter, flitting about backyard feeders. The junco is rarely seen in New York in summer, except here, among the high peaks, where the air is chilly year-round. This is one of the region's few alpine environments, home to many rare plants that somehow survive against all odds on this exposed granite outcrop. Alpine environments are found above the tree line, where cold temperatures and a lack of adequate soil, moisture, and nutrients make it nearly impossible for most plants to survive. Mountain sandwort, a showy wildflower, grows wild on the tundra far to the north, but never below the tree line. Sandwort thrives in crevices and on stone ledges where soil is extremely thin and of such marginal quality that competition for it from other plants is nearly non-existent. Just a few hundred feet down the mountain, blue gentian springs up from coarse gravel outwash near mountain streams. Rare ferns and mosses line these streams, fed by the thin overmat of soil that underlies this extensive mountainside spruce and cedar forest. Geologists have debated whether the vertical height of the Laurentide ice sheet reached this elevation. Many believe it did. One telltale sign of ice movement is striation, gouges in rock surfaces that resulted from ice-encased boulders and other materials scraping against these granite surfaces as glaciers advanced and retreated time and again. There appear to be striations on outcrops here at the very top of Whiteface Mountain. There is no question the ice sheet had a major impact on the current size and shape of Whiteface. This mountain is a classic example of how repeated advancing and retreating of glaciers gouge stone mountainsides over time, creating predictable geological patterns found in mountain ranges the world over. Glaciers are typically extensions or lobes of more expansive ice sheets pushed and pulled along by the weight of the greater ice mass. This action eventually carved out bowl-shaped amphitheaters called cirques. Whiteface has 3 steep-walled cirques along its sides. In early September 1979, this forest mat was suddenly and catastrophically saturated during an unusually violent downpour. Untold volumes of water drained toward the center of the cirque, much as highway runoff collects in low spots and follows the path of least resistance into storm drains. The center core of the mat, abruptly lifted by a surge of rainwater, separated from the rock face and slid down the mountainside. The scar is still visible, and it may be thousands of years before enough soil accumulates to restore the forest to its previous state. At the edges of each cirque, arêtes, heaps of boulders and stone fragments dislodged and piled high by the glaciers, then left in place as the ice retreated. This image of Whiteface Mountain in winter is a dramatic illustration of the cirque arête phenomenon, highlighted by the tight arc of Whiteface Mountain Parkway near the base of the summit trail. This is a familiar scene, not only in the Adirondacks, but also along Canada's Laurentian mountain range, Europe's Alps, the Himalayas of Asia, and the Andes Mountains of South America. While it may be gone forever, the Laurentide ice sheet will continue to affect the region geographically for thousands of years into the future. At its height, the colossal weight of mile-high ice put enormous downward pressure on Earth's crust. Like a giant trampoline, the land has been rebounding ever since, but unevenly. Southern upstate New York, where the ice retreated completely long before it melted farther to the north, has finished rebounding. But the city of Kingston, on Lake Ontario's northeastern shore, is still rising at more than 1 centimeter each year. The region around Lake Champlain has rebounded more than 500 feet since the ice retreated. In fact, the entire eastern rim of Lake Ontario is rising, a phenomenon called upwarping, while land to the southwest within the Great Lakes Basin is actually falling. Over the past several thousand years, this has resulted in Lake Ontario tipping slightly to the south. Harbors and bays, like this one at Oswego, New York, have become relatively deep basins. Once a shallow river delta, Oswego Harbor is now deep enough to accommodate large-hulled, ocean-going cargo ships without the need for constant dredging. As the Canadian mainland continues to rise up, the St. Lawrence River, outflow to the sea for all the Great Lakes, rises with it. The St. Lawrence is relatively shallow where Lake Ontario flows into it. Even the smallest watercraft must be careful to avoid rocky shoals that lie just a foot or two below this wide point in the river off Cape Vincent. River pilots guide ocean-going ships through a narrow passage of the St. Lawrence Seaway here to avoid grounding them. That channel is relatively deep, at 80 feet or so. But as the upwarping continues, could the day come when the Great Lakes begin to drain southward instead of northward through the St. Lawrence River Basin, as it does today? Scientists say yes. Across upstate New York, the sea has flooded in and receded repeatedly over millions of years. Sediments from these floods comprise the region's rocky foundation end to end, from the layers of fossil-filled sandstone at Quarry Farm to the limestone formations that underlie the seemingly indestructible cap rock at Niagara Falls. Far into the future, the sea will return, and by then the ice will have come and gone yet again. These events are predictable and inevitable, the result of oscillations in the Earth's attitude toward the sun, as recorded in the geological record over billions of years. Scientists say the Earth began cooling again about 4,000 years ago, right on schedule toward the next ice age. Modern-day global warming won't stop the ice. Its effects may devastate human and other life forms, but the geological effects will be relatively short-term, a brief blip on Earth's ultimate timeline. When the ice returns and melts away once more, a new set of Ice Age footprints will mark the northern landscape, and most everything we have just seen will be wiped away forever. Only the sea will look the same. Mountain sand wart. Rockwort